right, welcome back. We're going to talk about the good life. So the topic of this video and the next couple of videos is what is the good life? And as we discussed in class, the question of the nature of the good life we're going to treat basically as the same as the question of what is a well-lived human life? What is flourishing, well-being, or welfare for a human? We're going to kind of treat those all interchangeably. A philosophical theory of the good life, in general terms, has a couple of components. Usually there's what's called a theory of value as the kind of starting point of the theory. And I'll discuss what that is in just a second. And then in addition, usually a theory of the good life adds to its theory of value an account of how best one should organize goods or values across one's life in order for that life to go well. So what is a theory of value, that first aspect of a theory of the good life? A theory of value specifies the basic units of intrinsic goodness and badness, or value and disvalue. And as we've discussed in class, there's two different ways for something to be good or bad for an individual, good or bad for me. There's extrinsic goodness or badness, or value or disvalue, which is the goodness or badness a thing has because of something else. So for example, wealth is just extrinsically good, only good for you insofar as you can get something with it. Poverty, likewise, or lack of wealth, is extrinsically bad. It is bad for you insofar as it prevents you from getting the resources you need to the material resources, the food, the shelter, the education, and so on. Those are the things you want, and being deprived of the money is a way of being deprived of those things that you ultimately want. And so the loss of the money itself is an extrinsic bad. Intrinsic goodness and badness, if there is such a thing, these are going to be things that are good in and of themselves, regardless of their consequences. There are few uncontroversial examples of intrinsic goods and bads. That's part of what ethicists and sometimes called value theorists, philosophers who discuss value, it's part of what they argue about. There's a lot of disagreement about what are the units of basic goodness and badness at the intrinsic level. What is valuable in and of itself? Happiness, I think, construed as a well-lived life, is generally agreed to be an intrinsic good. Beyond that, though, there's a lot of further disagreement. I mean, is knowledge intrinsically good, or is knowledge only a useful tool to get us things that we want? Is freedom an intrinsic good, or is freedom only good insofar as you do good things with freedom? Likewise, we discussed in class, beauty came up. Is beauty good all by itself, or is it really the kind of experience that you're after when you find something beautiful to have value? What you're really valuing is the aesthetic experience you're having, and not the quality of the painting, say, itself. So hedonism has a theory of value, and that's going to emerge as we go. But in the really big picture, hedonism is a theory of the good life, according to which the good life is the maximally pleasant life, the life that has the most pleasure and least pain as possible. It's very big picture and requires some nuancing as we go along. So don't take this as the final version of hedonism. This just gives you a sense of what their view of the good life is. So here is Epicurus, who you read in the letter. He says this, "For it is to obtain this end that we always act, namely to avoid pain and fear. And for this cause we call pleasure the beginning and end of the blessed life." So we are always acting for the sake of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. We want those things in and of themselves, and everything else we do as a means to achieving pleasure and the avoidance of pain. We recognize pleasure as the first good innate to us, and from pleasure we begin every act of choice and avoidance, and to pleasure we return again, using the feeling as a standard by which to judge every good. Your friends are only good for you insofar as they bring about pleasant feelings for you. Religious belief is only good insofar as it makes you happy. And so it goes for everything else other than pleasure. So why think this? This is a really radical view of the good life. I mean, in some ways you might think, well, that's kind of common sense, right? Like you want to feel good. But on the other hand, when you pause to think about what it implies, it does have some very surprising and maybe troubling implications. I mean, I like to think that my relationships and my friendships are good apart from whether they bring me pleasure, right? But if the hedonist is right, then no, that's not true. So why should we believe this view? You didn't read John Stuart Mill, but he is one of the most famous hedonists. He also is a utilitarian. We're not going to talk about utilitarianism, but that is a moral theory that takes hedonism as its basis, basically. But I just wanted to pull out this passage from Mill because I think it's instructive as to what the standard motivation or argument for hedonism is. And it's tied to the idea of happiness. Here's what Mill says. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. He's just there telling us what that word means for him. Happiness just means pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the absence of pleasure. Happiness just means pleasure and the absence of pain. Unhappiness just means pain and the absence of pleasure. He goes on to say later, pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. This is very much what Epicurus was just saying. And that all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as any other scheme, that is, he thinks, sure, there are lots of things that are good, but they're only extrinsically good. They're desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. So that second paragraph, you see a lot of similarity with what Epicurus said. But the little additional bit you're seeing here in Mill is this explicit tying together with the hedonist approach to what has value, their theory of value as pleasure and the avoidance of pain, with this idea of happiness. And this is basically the basis of what is maybe one of the only arguments for hedonism. I don't myself think it's all that convincing. I mean, if you're not already a hedonist, I think you're going to want to put on the brakes in a number of places here, and the hedonist isn't going to have much to say to convince you. But it's worth walking through what their reasoning is so that we can get a fuller picture of their view. So the first premise of this argument is, 1, happiness is the only intrinsic good. So notice we haven't mentioned anything about pleasure here. The first premise is just about happiness. And the claim is essentially a theory of value, that the only thing that is intrinsically good is happiness. And once again, you might think, well, that seems just as controversial as the claim that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. What about all these other things? Why don't they count? And here's a brief little defense of that first premise. Once again, I think that probably if you're not already sympathetic with hedonism, this may not move you, but this is their reasoning. First, they just remind us of what the definition of an intrinsic good is. It's just that something that's desirable for its own sake. Look into our own psychology and think about what we want for its own sake. And that tells us what the intrinsic goods are. Now, they then add the second step. So if intrinsic goods are just all and only those things that are desirable for their own sake, that's just the definition of an intrinsic good. They then add what is effectively a statement of general psychological egoism. They say, look, my happiness or my self-interest is the only thing that's desirable for its own sake. The only thing I want for its own sake is my own happiness. So here you see a commitment to psychological egoism being folded into their argument. And so if you weren't on board with egoism, then you're not going to like this argument for hedonism. Conversely, though, if you thought, there's something to what the egoist is saying, when I'm honest with myself about my own motives, I do think that I'm ultimately motivated by my self-interest in pretty much everything I do. Then the hedonist says, well, then you should buy this first premise. You should think that your happiness is the only thing that's intrinsically good for you, because that follows from those two earlier steps. The intrinsic goods are the things that are desirable for their own sake, and happiness is the only thing that's desirable for its own sake. To the extent that you find the things on the left-hand side good, and somebody says, why do you care about that? You're eventually going to wind your way to happiness. And if somebody says, well, why do you want to be happy? You're like, well, because happiness is good. It's an intrinsic good. So it follows that happiness is the only intrinsic good, given step 1.1 and 1.2. And that's just a defense of that first premise that draws on the definition of an intrinsic good and pairs it with the psychological egoist claim about what we desire. The next step is an identification of happiness with pleasure. And we saw this in Mill. By happiness, I mean pleasure and the avoidance of pain, right? There's not as much of a sort of elaborate defense of the second premise as there is just a claim about what language means, right? When we use the word happiness, or when we say I'm happy, we basically just mean I'm feeling joy, or I'm feeling pleasant, or I'm feeling good. Those are just like interchangeable words. That's the claim, at least. I think that it's debatable as a linguistic hypothesis, but that's the kind of thing that Mill seems to think is true. I should note here that even if that's right, most hedonists recognize different kinds of pleasure. So sometimes, and you see this in Mill, there's a distinction drawn between lower pleasures and higher pleasures. Lower pleasures, paradigmatically, are things like the kinds of pleasures you get from food, television, drugs, sex. Those are the sort of simple bodily pleasures, right? And these are also the kinds of pleasures that non-human animals experience. Then there's this other kind of pleasure, or pleasures of another kind. There's the pleasure that one can get from studying, from learning. And that's a kind of pleasure. It's very different in kind from the lower pleasures, but it's a pleasure nonetheless. And it's also one that's sort of unique to us, that we're able to do this. There's aesthetic enjoyment, the experience of beauty, or listening to some excellent music can bring about a kind of feeling of like exaltation almost, that is not something that from the inside feels quite like eating chocolate cake, right? It feels a little bit higher, so to speak. And you might also include some sort of general sense of like feeling fulfilled with one's life, feeling meaning. This came up a couple times in class. The hedonist wants to fold all of that into the idea of what pleasure is. Now notice that if we've got the first step, happiness is the only intrinsic good. The second step, happiness just is pleasure. It validly follows that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. So if you were on board with that first step and you thought this hypothesis that what we mean by happiness is the same thing as what we mean by pleasure, then it validly follows that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. And that third step is basically the hedonist's theory of value. They're giving us a specification of the basic units of intrinsic goodness. Everything else that's good is good in virtue of, or because it brings about pleasure. That's not the entirety of the argument, though, because as we saw at the beginning, a theory of the good life includes a theory of value, but isn't exhausted by a theory of value. So in addition to telling us what has intrinsic value and disvalue, what's intrinsically good and bad for me, a philosopher who's giving an account of the good life should also tell us something about how the intrinsic goods should be sort of organized across a person's life. in order for their life to go well. It's one thing to say that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. It's something else to say, well, how much of it should I go after? Would it be better for me to have some of it sometimes and something else at other points? This is especially important if you're a value pluralist. We talked about Aristotle as a value pluralist. For him, he's got many different sources of intrinsic value. And so it's a much more urgent question. Well, how do you organize them all? The hedonist, though, says, look, I just have one unit of intrinsic pleasure, intrinsic value, and that's pleasure. It's not too complicated how it should be organized. And when we think about like the good life, what we want is the life that is the best. And that's just another way of saying the life of maximal net goodness. Whatever the units of goodness or badness are, pleasure or virtue or whatever, seems pretty reasonable to think that what makes a life go well is you kind of add up all of the intrinsic goods and subtract all of the intrinsic bads, right? And what you get is net goodness. And you want the highest number, the highest possible net goodness you can get. And the hedonist looks at that and says, it's pretty straightforward and fits with also my theory of value. Now, suppose you're not convinced about this, though. You're like, I don't know about maximizing. I don't know about maximal net goodness. That seems too like calculating. It seems like math or something. Like, why should I think that goodness can be stacked in this way? This isn't a super sturdy defense of that claim, but it's something. You might think that goodness is additive, just as you might think that certain physical properties are additive. You might think that if you've got one bit of something good, that if you continue to add more things of that kind, that what you would get would be better, right? More of a good thing is better. This principle, one way of putting it, is that the value or goodness of a whole is entirely a function of the value or goodness of its individual parts, right? Like if you think about something simple, like the taste, a good taste, the good taste of an ice cream sundae, like the tastiness of the ice cream sundae is completely determined by the tastiness of the parts. The way that the sprinkles taste, the way the different flavors of ice cream taste, the way the chocolate sauce tastes and the cherry, all of those things sort of blend together to create a larger whole that is better than the individual parts, but that is basically the addition of those parts. You're not like gonna put ice cream, chocolate sauce, and sprinkles together one day and suddenly end up with something terrible, right? That tastes terrible unless it's like gone bad or something. So you can see how the thought here is that if you swap out a good part for a bad part, that's going to affect the goodness of the whole because value is additive. So if we swap out sprinkles for rocks, that's going to make a big difference to the value of the whole. And the hedonist and friends of maximizing theories of goodness will be like, that's because value is additive. When we take this principle and apply it to a life, it's very complicated, much more complicated than an ice cream sundae. But in principle, the thought is that at the end of the day, the difference is only one of complexity, not one of kind. So if one were able to assign numbers, this is obviously hugely idealized, but if you were able to assign numbers of value to bad things in your life and good things in your life, the additivity of value principle suggests that the sort of overall goodness of your life would be a direct function of the negative numbers added to the positive numbers. So here we've got a little lifespan. Starts off okay, you're born, then you have a rocky period, some teenage delinquency, you go to prison for a little bit, that's not a good experience. So you get a -1 on your sort of overall life scorecard. But then you pull your life together, you go to college, and that's pretty enjoyable experience. Has its moments of difficulty, but overall, it's good for you. +1. Then you meet somebody, get married. That's wonderful. You get +2. Then there's a long period of work, lots and lots of work. You enjoy your work, but it's hard. You enjoy being home at the end of the day. And on balance, it's kind of neutral that you had to do that. But then retirement's fun. You get, cruise ship +1 there. And then you have a bit of a painful death, so -2. So when you add together all these numbers, the net goodness of your life is a +1. And the thought behind this fourth premise is that what you want is to maximize that net number. If we grant the hedonist each of these premises, that happiness is the only intrinsic good, happiness is pleasure, it follows that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. Now add to that this claim that the good life is just the life of maximal net pleasure, of maximal net goodness. It follows from that the good life is the life of maximal net pleasure. And notice that step 3 there is functioning both as a premise in the second half of the argument and as a sub-conclusion. Namely, it validly follows from 1 and 2, but then 3 together with 4 validly entails 5, and 5 is the final conclusion. It's also the statement of what hedonism says, that the good life is the life of maximal net pleasure. And that gives us a bit more of a concrete specification of what the pleasant life means. It's specifically maximal net pleasure. So just as maximal net goodness is the highest amount of total goodness minus total badness, if we're plugging in pleasure and pain as our units of goodness and badness, net pleasure, maximal net pleasure, is the highest possible number resulting from taking the total amount of pleasure and subtracting the total amount of pain felt across a life. That's what you want, is to maximize that number. So this was our kind of chart we had before, and now we're just sort of supposing that the positives are specifically pleasure units and the negatives are specifically pain units, as opposed to just generally good and bad. In this case, I think I fiddled with the numbers here a little bit, added a fun childhood, and made the death a little bit less brutal, and the retirement stayed the same. You get a score of 5 for your total pleasure, and a score of -2 for your total pain. And so net pleasure here is 3, a score of 3, 5 minus 2. The thing you want to do, of course, is get a lot more than that. I mean, that's you're up above the 0 mark, so your life is okay. But the hedonist thinks you should try to maximize. So, for example, maybe you could have had a really fun childhood, just a little bit more pleasure at the beginning. Maybe you did some fun travel between college and marriage, another +1. And maybe you've met someone different and your marriage went even better, right? +3. And then you managed to have as a career not something that was just bearable, but some dream career, becoming a chef. And that's very pleasant, so you get a +1 there. Your retirement is awesome, cruise ships, +2. And then at the end there, you see you sort of die peacefully. Death is not ever going to be a positive thing, but the ideal would be to have a death that's sort of neutral, right? So this life, the thought clearly is better than the previous one, and the hedonist says we can account for that in this really simple way.